So I have a question for you. What's the scariest moment on a drop tower? Tonight's episode of Mike from the Party is somewhat unique and calls for a different kind of introduction. This, as you may recognise, is a drop tower, a staple of the modern theme park. A tall, imposing structure where you rise to the top and then drop downwards. Sounds scary, right? But back to that question. What's the scariest moment on a drop tower? If you think it's the drop, you're wrong. It's the moment right before the drop. This drop tower is found at Thorpe Park in England and is called Detonator. This ride has no overt elaborate backstory, no intricate theming, and yet it's remarkably effective. What it's aiming to do is create that escalating sense of fear. The ride begins by taking 18 seconds to slowly rise above the park, and then it takes a moment to pause as it hangs 115 feet in the air for 12 seconds. Which may not seem like a long time, but when you're up there, that's an excruciating wait. It knows how achingly long it feels and revels in building up that tension. And when the drop happens, it's pretty intense, but also pretty fun. The drop is the release from this tension, because fear of the thing is scarier than the thing itself. Now let's get this party started. This whole party is kind of giving me Tower of Terror vibes. If you don't know, the Tower of Terror is a Disney drop tower ride, but also there's so much more to it, including gorgeous theming, an iconic pre-show, and multiple show scenes on the ride itself, leading up to the moment where it finally drops. The ride is loosely themed to the aesthetics of the 1959 anthology TV show The Twilight Zone, though rather than adapting any specific elements or even, to be honest, the actual tone of the original show, it mainly uses this as an atmospheric framing device. It instead focuses on telling a primarily original story of an elevator in a Hollywood hotel that disappears without a trace during a stormy night in 1939, which, according to a now deleted post on Disney's social media, was a year that was a vibe. Yikes. Yet it's remarkably effective. It's an exercise in how you can take something simple and add a bunch of bells and whistles to it to enhance that escalating sense of fear. In my opinion, this combination of thrill and theming came together to create one of the scariest rides Disney ever built. I'm easily spooked, granted, but every time I enter the building, I always felt this level of dread for what I was about to experience. Granted, that's partly my aversion to drop towers, but more down to the effective way this experience was curated, combining the simplicity of a drop tower with this Disney sense of showmanship. In my opinion, it's really something special. Or was something special, I should say. Sadly, 12 years after it opened, this classic Disney ride had its terror ruined by an update which brought a brand new story that sapped any tension out of the original experience. I am of course talking about Tower of Terror: A New Dimension of Chills, which opened at Disneyland Paris in 2019. Oh, did you think I was going to talk about the Guardians of the Galaxy retheme of Tower of Terror in California? Sorry, hear this accent. I'm European, baby. So this version of the Tower of Terror originally opened in 2007 at the Walt Disney Studios Park in Paris. This park is the second theme park at the Disneyland Paris resort and has a reputation for being the worst Disney theme park in the world, which is because it is, comfortably. I've been to parking lots with more atmosphere than this park. And despite the attempt to fix it with $1.5 billion and a confusing new name, sadly I don't think this is going to change from being a bad theme park anytime soon. However, one of the main reasons I believed it was worth dipping out of the gorgeous Disneyland park and heading over to enjoy this park in the first place was the Tower of Terror. Whilst being in some respects a lesser version compared to the original iteration of this ride in Orlando, this attraction was, in my opinion, still a stone cold classic. Thrilling, atmospheric, a little silly, but ultimately still genuinely scary. In 2019, however, Disney announced an update to the ride called A New Dimension of Chills, with Disney teasing 3 new additional stories they were adding to the ride, accompanied with brand new special effects and drop sequences. On the surface, it's not the most significant of changes. This version of the ride still maintains the same theming, pre-show, and overall aesthetic of the original ride. In comparison, the near identical version of the Tower of Terror over in California had a couple of years prior radically changed all of these elements as part of a Marvel retheme to extremely polarized opinions. But whilst the changes in Paris were relatively minor in comparison, I think these significantly changed the experience. Why? Let me tell you how Disney ruined the tension of the Tower of Terror. It's no red cup, is it? To understand why the Tower of Terror stopped being scary, it's important to look at why it was so effective in the first place. If you went on the California version of the ride before it got its Marvel makeover, this version in Paris was almost identical. So the experience begins arguably before you even enter the queue line, as you approach the imposing structure of the tower itself, which the Walt Disney Studios Park decided to build right in the centre of the park, which does fit the general design philosophy of this park, which I would describe as, we don't know what we're doing. Some other moments in this park following this design philosophy is having the entire park be a jumbled mess of random attractions, having the only aesthetically pleasing area of the park be themed to Paris, despite central Paris being only 28 miles away, and deciding to retheme an attraction in which the signature moment is a truck setting on fire to the Pixar Cars franchise, meaning that the truck you're watching go up in flames is now a living being. Still, despite its bizarre placement, the Tower of Terror remains an imposing structure which sets the tone of this experience before you even enter the queue line. You start by entering the dusty hotel lobby before heading into the library where you watch a pre-show that takes on the format of an episode of The Twilight Zone, with Rod Serling, host of the original show, introducing the ride's story of a stormy night in Hollywood where a group of people enter the elevator of the Hollywood Tower Hotel. The hotel is struck by lightning, which causes the occupants of the elevator to mysteriously vanish. But now it's our turn to enter the elevator and journey to the Twilight Zone. You then line up in the boiler room before entering the elevator itself for the ride portion of this experience. The ride starts by moving backwards into an elevator shaft as a projection inspired by the Twilight Zone intro appears in front of you, and French Rod Serling says intimidating sounding things.
Vous êtes les passagers d'un des ascenseurs les plus stupéfiants qui soit.
You then rise up to a floor of the hotel where you can see a large mirror in front. Lightning strikes and the reflection of the riders in the mirror becomes distorted before disappearing completely, showing an empty elevator remaining. The ride then moves up to a long hotel corridor with another elevator at the far end. The ghosts of the people who disappeared in the pre-show appear and beckon the rider to join them before the whole hallway itself disappears in a starry sky, leaving just the elevator in the distance visible, floating in space. And then the ride finally drops, with two small drops in the dark, before rising to the top of the tower, taking a moment to pause with a view of the park below, before dropping up and down a number of times. It's not directly a parallel to the anticipation of the classic drop tower where you know once you reach the top, you're going to drop, but it works in a similar way, building up that fear but via the scenic route, teasing you and prolonging your fate as you move up and down between these show scenes. Compared to Detonator, there's a few decisions that make it less scary. It has a few smaller drops in the dark first before rising to the top for the larger one. The time it pauses at the top is much briefer, and the drops are also much less forceful. But also I think this is about matching the tone of the park it's in, to find that compromise to make sure the experience is Disney scary rather than genuinely terrifying for kids. Whilst the thrills might be less intense, in return you have all the show scenes and story elements. I think there's this idea amongst Disney fans that whenever Disney adds theming or a story, it enhances the thrills. The experience is more scary because of this story and theming. I would argue in this case it's more the inverse. The show scenes are more scary because of the thrills. We buy into the fear of what's being displayed more because of our own dreaded anticipation of what's to come. In a traditional dark ride, these scenes can maybe come across a little bit hokey or on the nose, but because you know you're about to drop, it puts you in this heightened state of tension that helps you buy into them. Okay, so that's why it worked. So what changed? So I have a question for you. What's the funniest moment on a drop tower? This is Cranky's Drop Tower, part of the Thomas the Tank Engine land at Drayton Manor in England. Yes, I know, but it's remarkably effective. This is a very different approach to the drop tower than something like Detonator. Beyond the smaller size, the way it drops is designed to do something very different.
Rather than attempting to create an escalating sense of fear and playing with that anticipation of a drop, here instead focuses on creating a sense of bounce. It's like when you're throwing a baby up in the air and catching it. When you do that, you're not trying to make the baby scream with fear, and if you are, seek therapy. Instead, you're, hopefully, trying to make the baby giggle. In the same way, this ride bounces you up and down to give that gleeful reaction. It's kind of funny. Rather than fear, the emotion it is aiming to create is joy.
So, before going on this new version of the Tower of Terror in Paris, I was aware it had changed, but knew very little about what had changed. I knew there was meant to be different storylines and drop sequences, but the fact I'd heard barely anything about it made me feel somewhere between cautious optimism and ignorant indifference. I definitely heard a lot less compared to the very loud discourse around the changes made to the near identical version of the Tower of Terror in California, turning it into a Guardians of the Galaxy themed ride called Mission Breakout. Now, not to add another lukewarm take on this ride, but personally I think while this version is solid, good fun, it's comfortably less compelling than the Tower of Terror, so I do get people who wish this change hadn't taken place, but I do think anyone claiming it ruins the original are sort of missing the point. This version isn't remotely trying to be like the original. This isn't the same as, I don't know, shoehorning the Guardians of the Galaxy into It's a Small World. Yes, which is happening in Tokyo, by the way. A character called Drax the Destroyer will be in a ride that's a plea for world peace. Me and the other two It's a Small World stans are very upset about this. Mission Breakout, on the other hand, is not a refresh or a retweak of the Tower of Terror, but using the mechanics of the previous ride to create essentially a brand new attraction. Guardians of the Galaxy is irreverent, self-deprecating, and occasionally funny. It's not really scary. I've already talked about how different drop towers try to create different emotions, and Joe Rohde, the lead designer of Mission Breakout, knew the importance of this.
Tower of Terror is modeled to produce a sensation of fear. It's a scary ride. This is not scary. This is an irreverent ride. So we need to change the emotional feeling of the ride.
As such, this new version of the ride is now a much funnier, sillier experience. But it's not just about how the theming of this reframes the mechanics of the ride. Detonator at Thorpe Park at one point inexplicably had an Angry Birds retheme, and yet it was still absolutely terrifying because the physical experience remained the same. Instead, the mechanics of the ride had to also change to match this.
We need a different emotion. We need laughter, and we need a gleeful kind of scream. We change the top of the physics of that arc so you hover more. You do, still fall, but you spend a lot more free fall time. When you take the baby and you throw them up in the air and you catch them, you throw them up in the air and you catch them, and they giggle, right? Because it's a fun feeling to be tossed up in the air and caught again. So little baby is giggling because of that feeling.
Yeah, that analogy I mentioned earlier when talking about Cranky's drop tower of a baby being tossed in the air, I plagiarised that from Joe Rohde. Sorry. Please don't tell H Bomber Guy. So different drop towers are programmed to drop in different ways, in what are known as drop profiles. And Mission Breakout, despite being a much larger, more thrilling ride than Cranky's drop tower, has a drop profile that is emotionally trying to create a similar kind of experience. It's using the drop tower to create that continual sense of dropping and provoke that gleeful kind of laughter that a bouncy type of drop profile creates. Fun, rather than fear. As such, yes, Mission Breakout's new profile loses that sense of tension and is a lot less scary than the Tower of Terror, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily worse. It's just aiming for something different. Ultimately, I didn't particularly connect with this version of the ride, but I don't think it's bad. It kind of comes down to personal taste, and I can acknowledge I'm an MCU hater, I prefer physical sets to media-based rides, and I'm not a fan of whatever aesthetic this is. But I can get why someone would prefer this, especially the more fun drop profile, and if I liked Marvel movies and was colorblind, maybe I would too. And that's something so cool about drop towers, you can change the physics to change the emotional impact. Mission Breakout uses the skeleton of the Tower of Terror to create an entirely different emotional experience that stands on its own 2 feet. So what does Paris do differently?
Unlike California, the goals of the Paris redo of the Tower of Terror appear to be a lot less radical. Seemingly on the surface here, very little is changed. Tower of Terror, A New Dimension of Chills, whilst changing the story, is clearly trying to keep the same foreboding tone, creepy aesthetic, and emotional feel of the original version of the ride. Dimension of Chills maintains the exact same queue and pre-show of the original attraction, with the differences only appearing once you enter the elevator and the ride itself begins. There are 3 different versions of the ride from this point onwards, each with different storylines and drop profiles. The most obvious change across all 3 versions is French rod Serling is gone now, and the connective tissue linking together the different scenes is a recurring projection of the ghost of the little girl who disappeared in the elevator during the pre-show, and her attempts to save us from the Twilight Zone while showing off her bilingual skills. These projections are actually the only new special effect here, with all other effects across all 3 new versions being modified effects from the original. All 3 versions begin with the little girl appearing and saying, "I wouldn't go in there if I were you," before we enter the elevator shaft and the doors close. The first version, known as the Malevolent Machine, is the closest to the original version of the ride. According to marketing materials, in this version of the story, the elevator itself is explicitly evil, though nothing within the ride itself seems to indicate this new story element. The mirror scene is tweaked to now include the little girl appearing and saying that we should have listened to her, whilst the next scene still has the original projection of the people in the elevator from the pre-show, followed by the whole hallway then disappearing into a starry field. The main change is now amongst the stars, we can now just see the little girl left floating in space, asking us to come with her to escape. After some dropping, the ride ends with the little girl warning us that next time we might not make it back, with both other versions of the ride ending the same way. The second version of this ride, the 5th Dimension, officially has a storyline involving us getting lost in the 5th dimension, though again, this is pretty easy to miss. The mirror scene plays out roughly the same, with a little girl appearing and telling us that she's trying to rescue us from getting lost in this dimension. The next scene, however, has been changed more significantly. Now, instead of the hotel hallway disappearing into a starfield, the scene starts as a starfield, and the hotel hallway gradually appears within it. You can't just put theme park effects on shuffle. A hotel hallway totally disappearing into space is cool, but a hotel hallway suddenly appearing is much less exciting. It's like if the Haunted Mansion pre-show every now and then was a really long room that became more and more ordinary looking. The third and most different version of the ride is called the Shaft Creatures, involving a story about creatures having invaded the elevator shaft. One thing I think is notable about this version is the interesting sound design of these cackling monsters to represent the creatures not just through the show scenes, but also whilst you're dropping. I'm a big fan of using audio effectively to create an atmosphere which establishes a deep sense of fear. For example, at the Efteling, the opening scenes of the Flying Dutchman brilliantly builds up this dread and fear of the unknown through a simple combination of strong sound design and darkness, and is much more effective than if they threw a bunch of special effects at you from the get-go. On the Tower of Terror, this audio-centric approach doesn't work because there's no chance to build up this atmosphere. The idea of these monsters isn't established beforehand, but instead thrown in partway through the ride via bilingual exposition, and the audio of both this exposition and the monsters themselves is largely drowned out by the sounds of people screaming. However, one thing I'll say is when the little girl says, "They know you're here. Whatever you do, don't scream." This feels like a top tier idea, which is sadly undercooked here. Monsters that feed off your screams has that classic Stephen Moffat Doctor Who monster vibe, a brilliant concept to build a theme park thrill ride around. Anyway, I do think this is a kind of fun idea that could have anchored a significantly different, but more tonally consistent new version of this ride, and it's a shame it doesn't get the chance here to land as a concept. It's something I'd like to see them expand on if, as rumoured, the Twilight Zone theming of this attraction is eventually removed. Overall, it's really difficult to distinguish these versions narratively from each other. These new plotlines aren't established at all in the pre-show due to this being the same as the original ride, and all the dialogue during the already busy ride is trying to squeeze in this exposition in both French and English. I think generally theme park rides work better when they show rather than tell, but this is even more the case in a multilingual environment like Disneyland Paris. This was already a weakness of the original version of the ride in Paris. Whilst it could be switched to English if you specifically requested it, the default narration throughout the ride took place entirely in French. But ultimately, even if you didn't understand the narration, it was still fairly easy to follow on what was going on visually. Spooky haunted elevator, scary drop, Now, unless you're paying close attention, it's quite hard to follow these different stories despite them being quite radically different exposition-wise from each other. The problem is, despite these being different stories, visually they're essentially the same, and very few people are going to clock onto these differences. Sometimes these extra details are there for die-hard fans, like the complex lore of a coaster like Nemesis Reborn at Alton Towers engaging the enthusiasts, but actually being fairly irrelevant to the experience of a casual guest who are just riding a very cool looking alien-themed roller coaster. But here on the Tower of Terror, I don't think these different stories were even interesting or compelling enough to attract any real hardcore fan attention. Ultimately, whilst these changes in effects and attempt to add new storylines distract and muddy the ride's impact, sure, they don't fundamentally ruin the ride's tension. There's one much more simple but more significant change made across all three versions, which is the new drop profiles. So earlier I mentioned the scariest part of a drop tower was the moment right before the drop. Remember that? Glad you were paying attention. I do, after all, do this for the attention. In the original ride, it takes about 1 minute and 16 seconds, 55% of the total ride time, before the first drop takes place. And as such, in each of these show scenes, there is a sense of foreboding and dread as you anticipate the drop to come. It's working the same way as a simple drop tower like Detonator does. By intentionally holding back, it builds up that anticipation, ready for the moment that it fully drops. Now it only takes 18 seconds, 14% of the total ride time, before the ride starts to drop. And this 18 seconds isn't spent slowly rising upwards like a ride like Detonator does to build anticipation. Here we move backwards from where we first loaded, the creepy girl appears, and then we're suddenly either dropped downwards or launched upwards, depending on which version of the ride is being experienced. It's surprising, sure, but surprise is a different emotion than fear. It's about catching you off guard rather than making you scared for what's about to happen. It also means waiting for the next drop to take place is significantly less scary once you've already had the first drop. What's interesting is how this changes the feel of the show scenes. Whilst the scenes are on paper quite similar to the original, they now tonally feel a bit sillier. Part of the nature of this tension and release on these kind of rides is the drop happens, you scream, and then after you scream you laugh and you have that release. These scenes were designed around building on that sense of foreboding and dread based around that tension that riders would naturally be feeling, but now taking place after a drop, they lose the impact they once had. I mentioned earlier that it's hard to understand the new stories partly due to the bilingual exposition, but it's also kind of hard to hear what's being said regardless of the language. Almost every video of the ride online has an extremely noisy carriage during the actual dropping. As you would expect, the intent is to make you scream. But ideally, during the show scenes, especially when dialogue is being said, the riders are meant to be relatively quiet. However, listen to how the riders are reacting after the first drop during the show scene. Now you could argue that I'm cherry picking a rowdy, disrespectful crowd here to make a point, and yes, I'm sure you could share an anecdote of an equally noisy crowd in any other ride, but the point I'm making is, I don't think these riders are being disrespectful. They're having a quite natural, primal reaction to the aftermath of a drop, which is now the new context of this show scene. Notably, Mission Breakout has very exposition-heavy cue videos and pre-shows, but then once the ride starts dropping, has very little, quite simple dialogue which is designed to be screamed over. Why the same thought process wasn't also implemented by the Dimension of Chill's team, I don't know, but it means despite all the terrifying concepts being discussed by this little girl, we can't really hear them. Whilst I understand why people prefer the new version of Paris's Tower of Terror due to getting more dropping and therefore more thrill, I think less is sometimes more. The original, despite its bells and whistles, was quite focused on a simple idea. A drop is coming, and you should be scared. But by changing the ride profile to something more similar to Mission Breakout with the continual dropping, but also trying to keep the same scary tone, it feels like the worst of both worlds. It transforms the original's masterful suspense into a silly remix that uses all the same elements but in a less effective way, in what, to me, feels like a frustrating shadow of its former self. It's still well themed and a lot of fun, but I feel like the ride's original primary goal wasn't fun, it was fear, and by extension the fun of being scared. It's still a tower, but without the terror. Maybe they should change the name.